welcome to Drink this evening, everybody. It's been a few months since we last ran it. I think it was mid-November last time we held this, so we've left it a little while, but we do come back with a bang this evening. We've got some great speakers, some great panelists, and we are having a bit of a content special, as you'll have seen on all the promo stuff. As I have said before, but now we've got a few more people in the room, I would just like to reiterate that we do have a Q&A with our panelists at the end of proceedings this evening. So we welcome all questions that have any kind of relationship to the content theme of tonight and anything that you hear them talk about in their presentations. This is the webinar version of Zoom. If you've not seen this one before, there is a specific Q&A function. Obviously, there is the chat as well. So if you've got any questions, stick them into either of those, and we'll pick those up and make sure that they get posed to the panel at the appropriate time this evening. But as is ever the case with Drink, I'm going to start by walking through a few of the more recent happenings in the world of search, just to give us a few things to think about, and one or two things, if you've not picked up on, might be worth knowing. What has been going on with Google and search since last time? Last time being mid-November, so I've got a little bit to cover. This one won't surprise anybody. Just after we last met for a drink, when I think my slide said we may or may not get an update by the end of the month, by the end of the year, and Mr. Mueller at Google was being very non-committal. He must have known full well that this was coming, and he still didn't want to tell us. But here it is, 3rd of December, rolling out, and then, as usual, a couple of weeks rollout, and then confirmed complete. And as usual, Mr. Sullivan behind his search liaison account, basically referring you to the same thing they refer you to every single time there's a core update rollout over the last year and a half, which is their post on the Google blog about questions to ask yourself about your website if you've been impacted by a core update. And it obviously goes into a lot of stuff around EAT and some of the basics of SEO as well, mentioning titles and headings, and is it content that you would expect others to link to, those kinds of things. So, same old really with this core update. Reading around, looking at some of the analysis a few different people have published, a suggestion that YMYL sites, the Your Money, Your Life stuff, finance and health, held to a higher standard, and therefore, unsurprisingly, perhaps there's more volatility in those sectors seen as the rumblings after that core update. Again, that's pretty typical of core updates of recent times. Sites with lots of similar content, like voucher sites, lyric sites, those kinds of things, they saw a lot of volatility as well. So maybe there's something in this update, unsurprisingly, I suppose, looking at both quality of content and an element perhaps of uniqueness, or perhaps tightening up relevancy as well. So there is some evidence in some of this analysis of pages being rewarded for a really tight focus on a quite specific topic. So maybe that is something that Google's been trying to tweak a bit, and I suppose that probably falls into line with their use of BERT and ongoing improvements to natural language processing, understanding intent better and stuff. There was a suggestion from some in the industry as well that if you keep yo-yoing between core updates, then that's obviously, if you think about it, a suggestion that you're pretty close to the edge of what Google considers acceptable. So they tweak the dials, the numbers change a little bit in the way that things are balanced up, and one time you're in, one time you're out. You've got to be pretty close to the edge if that keeps happening to you. So you probably need to look at getting better in that respect. This core update brought further improvements for sites that had perhaps been impacted maybe 18 months ago, made improvements. They saw some benefits from previous core updates, and they continue to see further benefits with the most recent one, and that seems like a long-term trend. When you fix your stuff, it seems to get better and better as the core updates roll out. That's quite a common trend in these sites. So, bit of analysis there around what's been going on with that latest core update last December. John Mueller, previously mentioned, spoke at an event, I think towards the end of last year, and pretty well summed up by Barry Schwartz on Search Engine Roundtable. And you can see, you don't need me to read bullet points out to you, really, do you? But this is kind of your blueprint for SEO in 2021, I suppose. Some of it not that surprising, really, is it? Google trying to get better at not effectively penalizing sites where the people running them aren't necessarily that savvy about SEO, perhaps not that technical. That things will continue to be hard to explain, no doubt, because so much of it is machine learning based, and obviously you can have unintended consequences as machine learning works its way through all the data that it's got to change its algorithms with. Sounds like there's going to continue to be new features in the search results. No surprise there, but I suspect that's what he means by more ways to be visible. Trying to generate more repeat visitors. I think there's a suggestion there of potentially, a kind of a ranking reward when Google can see that people look for your brand. And obviously, yes, of course, it's easier to rank for your own name, but not necessarily sure that's what he was getting at. Modern formats, he's suggesting those are important. So, that could mean modern image formats like you see suggested by PageSpeed Insights using WebP, that kind of thing. Also page layouts and so on. Core Web Vitals, we already know that's going to be rolling out in May, so no surprise he mentions that. And he did say sites that are technically better have an advantage, and I suspect he's primarily talking about speed, but also about indexability and sites that don't generate tons and tons of cruft of faceted navigation that leads you to a million pages that you don't need, and pages with one product or 2 lines of text or whatever. I suspect he might have been talking about that as well. But some tips there from Mr. Mueller, not all of it terribly surprising, it must be said. Speaking of that May page experience update, signs of Google testing what has been suggested, that they will sort of badge sites in search results. Obviously, this will bring back memories of when AMP started to roll out the first time round. I'm not sure any consumer is going to know what something that looks like a crosshead screw actually relates to, but this is something that somebody spotted in the wild. So whether they're going to use it or not in reality, whether the testing has shown them that people respond to it or not, I can't imagine it does, but we will wait and see for May. But it's one of those tools that Google uses as leverage to try and get webmasters to do their bidding, but who knows, may or may not come to fruition, that one. And speaking again of Core Web Vitals, just a handy tool you might find here, quite a good one for competitive analysis as well as looking at your own stuff. A Chrome plugin here to put Core Web Vitals scores into the search results. So you've got the three metrics they're using for Core Web Vitals there, displayed alongside each organic page in the search results. So you might find that useful for a bit of analysis. Google now give us crawl stats in a new form. Don't need to, well, not that you could anymore, but the old style ones from the old webmaster tools as was. You can now find them slightly bizarrely in the settings menu of Google Search Console, arrow pointing to where you find that in the settings page. And when you open out that report, that's the kind of thing that you'll see. Actually, there's a bit more to it than that. It doesn't really display on the slide very well there. So you'll get it by reasons. So there'll be like refreshing the index or discovery of new stuff. And you can see kind of a breakdown of that. You'll see a breakdown in the different bots crawling as well. So mobile, desktop, images and so on. So quite useful info there to see, especially if you've got technical issues with the site or something significant's changed recently. You can go and check how that's affecting your crawl stats in Search Console. Improvements to coverage report as well. So the coverage report in Search Console, the crawl anomaly, the frustrating, there's something going on, but we're not going to tell you what error is supposedly now mapped to something more descriptive. One of the other issues, which should be an improvement. Haven't noticed it change things massively, but yeah, that's certainly an improvement when it happens. There's an indexed without content warning, which we didn't have before. That's now something you may see in there. And an index but blocked warning when you've got pages in your XML sitemap, which you then robots.txt with a disallow. So that's, yeah, you do see that quite often, as obviously sites tend to generate XML sitemaps automatically from the database and just basically put everything that looks like a page into their XML sitemap. I'm sure you all know WordPress sites where everything that's technically a page, like bits of testimonials, bits of image galleries, and all of the bits of pages that some plugins work with, they end up getting submitted in sitemaps and stuff. So you might see that popping up in Search Console. And apparently the soft 404 reporting is now more accurate between, you know, what's really a soft 404 and what is actually just a bit of a short page or one that looks similar to others. So that should help us a little bit more diagnose issues with their sites in Search Console. On the local side, Google now have this community feed in the Maps app on mobile. You can read more about that at the link there, but this is really something, if you use the Google Maps app, they're trying to introduce more, I don't know if social is quite too strong a term, but certainly you can follow businesses and stuff on here. So it makes it, if you're posting, for example, as a business on Google My Business, they reckon with this feature enabled, gives you about double the visibility of the things that you're posting and things like that. So it's a way for people basically to stay on top of what's going on with their favorite businesses. They can also get guidance from trusted local reviewers and stuff, and for a particular area through that feed as well. So adding kind of social features into Google Maps there. Similarly, actually also on the Google Maps app, you can now get your messaging from Google My Business in the Maps app. You don't need the separate Google My Business app anymore. So if you're logging into Google Maps on your phone with the same login that you use for Google My Business, you'll be able to enable the messaging feature in Google Maps. And if somebody sends you a message from your listing on Google, that's where it will show up. So you can go to update messages in the app to turn it on. And they are going to roll that out shortly into the actual web interface of Google My Business as well. So you won't even need to do it through an app on your phone anymore. You'll actually be able to log into Google My Business and respond through the website. So that's quite handy. And users can now message straight from posts that you make on there, as well as the button that you get in the main panel for the business. So more info on that in that link at the bottom. Google My Business now has updated performance insights. This is kind of rolling out. You're getting the old and the new at the moment in the accounts that I've seen, and you can click to view the new stuff. You get a longer period of data, which is always helpful. And you can see actual search queries that people have used when your business showed up in its Google My Business format. So that is better data from Google, a bit more understanding of how people are getting to your business on there. So that's always welcome. Moving on to the PPC side of things, we've got Google killing broad match modified, and you can see in the diagram that they put into their article there how phrase match is now going to behave like broad match modified, which is a delight to all of our PPC managers, I can assure you. So that it will still work for now, but you won't be able to create new broad match modified keywords from the 18th of July, and broad match modified is going to basically work the same as phrase match from now on. So no choice about that. Slightly frustrating, but there we go. That's classic Google. This is, I think, actually less worrying. When you first see a headline that says target CPA and target ROAS are disappearing as bid strategies, you get a bit excited. But it's only because they are now going to be essentially optional within the maximize conversions or maximize conversion value respectively strategies. So they'll still be there and you can still use them in the same way. Maybe that's going to change how they work. Not obvious. This was something that came from the developers blog rather than the Google Ads blog. So nobody's talked about how it changes in the interface yet, but Google have documented how it changes in the API. So if you want to read a bit more about that, there is the link to their blog. We have the smart bidding data exclusion stuff in here, so that's quite handy. You know, if you've seen an unusual change in performance for some reason during a period of time, you can exclude that from the way that smart bidding is using the data for its machine learning stuff. So, you know, if you have a sudden spike because you've just run a 50% off sale for the weekend, you may well want to exclude that weekend from your data because clearly it behaves very differently to the norm. And you can now do that in here so you don't confuse the machine when it's looking at that data. And finally, the obligatory mention of Bing, or as it's now known, Microsoft Ads. And they have introduced this thing called filter linked extensions. And this is very much like the structured snippets that you get in Google Ads, except you can also make them links. And I think you can have up to 36, I read. So a little bit different. And if you do run Bing ads, definitely something to go and have a little play with, because you could well give yourself a little bit of a competitive edge with those as well. So You want to read more about that? There is an article explaining all on Search Engine Land. Okay, that's enough from me. We don't have a date for the next drink arranged as yet, so keep an eye on the socials and the emails from Meetup and all that kind of stuff for that. But what I'm now going to do is hand over to our first speaker this evening, which is my esteemed colleague, all the way live from Malaga, over to Mr. Barker, who should just be able to share his screen, replacing me and everybody else with his wonderful presentation.
I believe so. Let's have a look. Not if you pressed it before you press the share button, it would appear. So if I share that.
There we go. All good.
Hopefully
okay, so
you can.
Just before I hand over to you, a reminder to everybody, if you've got any questions in here related to what Wayne's about to talk about, or even tangentially related to it, please pop those into the question and answer or the chat box, and we'll ask those of the panel when we get to that point after Hannah's spoken. I've got a raised hand from one of our participants who's completely disappeared off my thing, and now there is no raised hand. So I'm going to assume that that was a tentative pushing of buttons just to see what happens, and I'm going to shut up and hand over to Mr. Wayne Barker.
Thank you, Mr. Lockwood. Good evening. So for those of you that have not attended Drink before, my name's Wayne. I'm the Director of Online Marketing at Boom, and that's all the shit you actually need to know about me. So just so you know, no one can see anyone apart from the panelists. Okay, so we can see none of the participants because we're on webinar view. So what I want you to do is just close your eyes for a second, and I want you to imagine something. I want you to imagine that you're in the good old US of A. Okay, so place yourself in America. And then what I want you to do is imagine that you're at a cinema. So you've got some lovely popcorn, you know, you sat down. We all remember cinemas, right? They were a thing that we used to go to. I'm not going to brag, but over in Malaga, we are allowed cinemas open in the daytime. So I'm very sorry about that. And then what I want you to do is imagine the sort of thing that used to happen in cinemas in America in the 1950s onwards, which was when they used to have a double bill of B movies like 20 Redirects Later and The Crow. And the thing with this is, I'm not trying to get you to imagine what it's like in America, because we had it pretty shitty over here. We had carry-on films. We didn't have double bills. We had Kenneth Williams and God rest her soul, Barbara Windsor. So I guess what I've done for you there is painted a picture that you can't really imagine at all, because none of us live in America. It's something that we're not necessarily familiar with, but that is something that I want to touch upon in what I'm going to talk about today. So here we go. This is what I'm talking about on this this version of Drink Digital. I'm talking about Roger Corman and Easy Riders, Make It Cheap and Fail Fast. So if you're not familiar with the director and producer of films from the 1950s onwards, Roger Corman gave us such classics as these kind of sci-fi films called Attack of the Crab Monsters, From the Depths of the Sea, A Tidal Wave of Terror. He also gave us these kind of films like The Trip, which tapped into the drug culture of America during the late 50s, early 60s, which was presented in psychedelic color, obvious pun there. And you'll see from that poster that you got a lovely Sort of Death, which is a less than obvious acronym for LSD there. He also gave us kind of horror films like The Mask of the Red Death. We defy you to stare into this face. And then neo sort of noir films like Sorority Girl. And then he also tapped into the motorcycle culture of the 60s as well, and gave us films like The Wild Angels. And I was talking to Pete, who's on the panel today, and he didn't realize that a lot of the films that he actually loves and really enjoys were actually directed by Roger Corman. And I think The film that people are going to be most familiar with that Corman directed, although it's it's not the film they're going to know, but the remake they're going to be familiar with. He directed the original version of The Little Shop of Horrors, not the Feed Me Seymour one, but the original one, which actually I believe was the first film that Jack Nicholson was really in. So Corman, between 1955 and 1970, directed 53 films. So that averages at something like 3.3 films a year during a 15-year span. And I went over to Google to have a look at how many films he's been involved in over time. And this is what Google came back to me with: at least 158. At least 158. So even Google hasn't got a fucking clue how many films Roger Corman has been involved in. I looked a bit deeper, and it's actually somewhere around 400 films that he's directed, or produced, or had some writing involvement in, or been an actor in. And then the thing is, what do all these films have in common, particularly the ones that he produced and directed? And the one thing they all have in common is, pretty much, as far as I can tell, without fail, they have all made money. Absolutely every single one of them. So I'm going to give you a bit of a quote from Corman himself, and you'll see how this connects into stuff later on. But Corman said, motion pictures are the art form of the 20th century, and one of the reasons is the fact that films are a slightly corrupted art form. They fit this century. They combine art and business. I want to run you through a couple of Cormanisms. I don't think they're really called that. It's just what I decided to call them. There's a link at the bottom there. When we share these slides, you'll be able to check out where I got these Cormanisms from. And I want to explain how these sort of Cormanisms fit into what we do at Boom. So Roger Corman said that to make successful films, you need to build a crew that makes you proud. So for the Boom lot that are on the webinar tonight, hi. I think we can safely say that we've done that. He also said that you got to find a personal statement in every film. So how that relates to what we do at Boom is we want people to care about what they're making, the content they're making. It doesn't matter whether it's for a Ben Sherman or whether it's for the Garden Gate company round the corner. You've got to care about what you're making. Corman also said, stick up for yourself and your beliefs. Something we believe in at Boom is that on our content ideas, we will get approval one way or another. Corman also said that you got to create guidelines for your films. And the way that relates to what we do at Boom is we've always said that formats can be good. We do follow formats until we think that they're failing, and then we ditch them and maybe come back to them later. Corman also said that you've got to realize your limits. So on the Boom side, that doesn't necessarily have to be artistic or creative limits. It also can be budgetary limits. So, you know, we've always said it's okay to do it on the cheap. Corman always said that you got to plan. Boom, we say you've got to process the shit out of stuff. Corman said uphold the B-movie smart by spending pragmatically, and I'll touch on this later, but what we say on the Boom side is don't put all your eggs in one basket. So they're the Cormanisms. So swag of beer, feed my ego, here's some Wayneisms. So I've got two fairly simple Wayneisms when it comes to content. One is make it fucking cheap. And the cheaper you can make it, the better, because when you're making things on cheap, when you're making them on a budget, and I'm not saying you can't do big budget stuff, but when you're making it cheap, you can fucking fail fast. Okay, so make it cheap, fail fast is something we've held at Boom for a long time. It started off because we were working with really tight budgetary requirements, And whilst we've expanded and started to spend more on content marketing projects, we still do believe to some extent that making it cheap and failing fast is a genuinely good thing. So just to come back to Corman and what he was doing between 1950 and 1970, 1955, 1970 particularly, but has done his entire career right up until 2016 or so, is he was working quickly. He didn't hang around. He got shit into production as quickly as possible. He jumped on trends. So like the Hells Angels kind of trends, the drug trends, he was jumping on those and promoting his films, making films around them. And the other thing that he did, and probably one of the most important things as far as I'm concerned, is he never got complacent. He never rested on his laurels. He was always moving. So this is meant to be about content. I'm already 10 minutes in and have not discussed a single thing about content marketing, links, social, anything like that. So let's get on with it. I always like to share. Sometimes people say I overshare, but what we're going to do is take a look behind the curtain at Boom with a little Twin Peaks reference in the background there that was added by my good friend Peter Bingham, which is probably the one and only B movie that was actually a TV series. So, creative content, for us at least, not for everyone, looks a bit like this. This is a piece that we did maybe 8-9 months ago that was a brand mashup. Basically, we took warring or let's say brands that were in active competition with. Sorry, Pete.
Rivals.
That's the word I was looking for. So yeah, we took rivals and we swapped their logos around. We made Burger King into McDonald's and vice versa, and we made somewhere around 10 of these. Another thing that we did, and this is quite an old one, is we looked at how much chocolate bars had shrunk over time. So that was data that was compiled by us by looking at pictures of the backs of chocolate bars from the 1950s onwards. And that was an interesting one because it started as a conversation round the Christmas dinner table at my parents' house when someone said, "Are chocolate bars shrinking?" And I said, "I can spend a couple of grand on that at Boom and try and figure it out for you." Turns out the actual answer is, yeah, sometimes no. This is another piece that we've done in the past. So this is foods that are hard to eat, which were then presented in an IKEA style, giving it a kind of hook. And this is another sort of quote from Roger Corman here. He says, "You can make a movie about anything as long as you have a hook to hang the advertising on." And internally, we used to reference those hooks as woodpeckers. But that's a presentation that I did a while back, so I won't touch on that, and I'll leave you to wonder what the fuck a woodpecker is, apart from that bird that eats and pecks wood. So that's the exciting side. The less exciting, less sexy side of it is that creative content also looks like this: spreadsheets. It's not all glamorous. So this is for a piece of content that we did where we actually gathered our own data in the office and tried to work out how much air was in packets of crisps and why that was there. So, you know, it's not always sexy. Our content team, be that outreach, part of the SEO team, the design team, do spend time digging around in our SEO tools. Now this is Ahrefs, and this is their Content Explorer, which is our one of choice just because it has better link data in there than say a BuzzSumo, although BuzzSumo does have some really good data in there. And it also looks like this. We track every single piece we do. So on that spreadsheet there, on the left is the title, then we've got the client, we've got the URL. I'd love to tell you those are blurred out because of NDAs, but we've blurred them out because there's some that we actually failed on really badly. And then we actually, what we do as well is we work out the type. So if it's a piece of artwork, if it's an infographic, whatever, it's all tracked in there. We know exactly what sort of thing we've got, and then we track how many links it gets over time. You'll notice we've got the average DA in there, which we know is a made-up metric that means absolutely nothing in the real world, but at the end of the day, you do need a metric in there, and it's the one that clients are more familiar with. And then we actually work out the average cost per link. So the average cost per link is actually based on some black hat sales data on how much they sell links for, and then some maybe stuff that I found out about other agencies and how much they charge for links. I'm not saying where I got that data from, but that's been collated into a formula. Anyone that's here today will probably know why we make creative content. We make it for traffic, whether that's via referrals. We make it for engagement, whether that's for brand or whether that's for social. But by and large, and I'm sure Hannah and Gisele and Mark will agree with me later on, one of the driving forces behind what we do is we do it for links. And it doesn't matter how long you've been in this business. It doesn't matter how long you've been building content. It doesn't matter if you were building them via directories or, you know, some of the spammy shit we did 10 years ago. Getting links feels good, and that's just and it genuinely, still to this day, there's no argument about it. It can move the needle when you do it right. So the other sort of thing that we do at Boom is we process the shit out of everything, as I mentioned earlier. So what we've done for a very long time is brainwriting, and I'm not scared to admit when I've stolen shit straight off people. So I don't think she's here tonight, but hat tip to Stacey McNaughton for when she worked at Techmark, and she introduced me to this kind of sort of process, which is a group of us. It's called the 635. I can't remember who invented it. Some a German marketer in the 60s, I think. But basically, what we do is a group of us at Boom will sit down. We can do it remotely via a tool that Techmark built that still sits there to this day, and we come up with as many ideas as we can in as quick a time as possible. We usually give the people that are involved a minute or so, and within half an hour, we've got 100 ideas. Do we have 100 great ideas? Nah. Do we get 98 shit ideas? Quite possibly. But we have, Pete's nodding along there, but we have a lot of ideas, and it's a refreshing way of working. You just empty your brain without thinking too much. And you'll notice in the bottom there, we've got someone gave up and just wrote monkey tennis, which happens quite a lot. When people run out of ideas around round 5 and 20 minutes in, we see Jurassic Park, just the phrase Jurassic Park turns up. But yeah, it's a great way to get a load of ideas really quickly. And what we do is we export a CSV from that tool, and then we move over to Trello to what we call the idea dumping ground. And literally everything gets dumped into there. So we have a place where every single idea, good or bad, has just lives forever. So we can always return and look over things that, you know, might have sounded like a shit idea a year ago, but at the moment, you know, maybe someone gets some inspiration. And from there, we take about 2 or 3 ideas to proceed to the next stage. And I mentioned that I'm not averse to admitting when I've stolen something. So I'm going to say hi to Hannah and Mark at this point. From their time in Distilled, I ripped this straight off them. So these guys, back in the old days, were talking about the Made to Stick success model, which was a book written by the Heath brothers, and they came up with 6 principles on how to create ideas that stick, that are memorable. So you had the 6 principles: simple, unexpected, concrete, credible, were they emotional, and did they have a story? Now that was several years ago, and my esteemed colleague, Mr. Bingham, has taken that and run with it over the last few years and made something that is for us, works a hell of a lot better. So this is what it looks like now. We have these run-throughs. So when we've got an idea and we think it's got potential, what we do is we run it through a Google Doc where the person who's got the main idea answers a bunch of questions, and they're based around simplicity, originality, relevancy, budget. Is the ideal universal? Does it have emotion attached? Memorability, which was coined by Mr. Bingham, credibility, outreach potential, and timing. Now, as an acronym, I don't think we're ever going to get this to stick because that is basically SUBUIMROT, which is an acronym that is never going to stick. And what we aim for is a score of 75 out of 100. If it passes that straight off, then we take it to the next stage. If it doesn't, we take it back to the team, and everyone that's involved in the process can have a chance to see if we can take it up to that sort of score. If there's anything that whoever was working on it might have missed or maybe understated. Again, that happens very quickly, much like Mr. Corman. We don't wait around, we move that through as quickly as possible. Then it goes to the approval stage. So we take it over to the client for approval. And I'm going to say at this stage, we get 100 out of 100 approvals, but that's not quite true because I think it's only about 99. Is that right, Pete? We only get 99 ideas approved. Yep. To be fair, our success rate of getting approval at this stage is always pretty good. We have a bunch of clients that I love with all my fucking heart because some of them don't even require to give us approval because we work with them so long. We don't even have to take it to them. We just move straight with it and it goes on their site. And probably the first time they see it is when it's live. But yeah, by and large, it gets approval. It then goes over to the design team who move it into another Trello board, which is where we have every piece of content that we're currently working on for any client. And any person who's involved in the content from inception through to the last day of outreach has visibility of that. So designers, outreach guys, PR guys, SEO account managers, anyone that's involved at any point has full visibility of this. We also bosh around and mess around with stuff in InVision, which is not client facing at all. That's completely for us, where we can scribble on stuff and write rude words and draw pictures that you only used to see on school books when you were 15. But that's our sort of internal sort of scrappy sort of let's just bosh around and figure this shit out kind of thing. It then goes to the feedback, sort of the final feedback, because we're constantly feedbacking. There's a constant feedback loop. It actually goes to everyone at Boom on a Slack channel, and then anyone's got the chance to sort of call us out on anything. At that point, we say, don't pick us up on the design because it's too fucking late for us to change that. But if you've got some small tweaks, call us out, and we'll see what we can do. So that's our proofing and breaking section of the process, and then of course it heads out to the World Wide Web where we get lots of horrible comments. For anyone that's ever been featured on the Daily Mail, there's always some interesting comments going on there. We've got some we've got some nice ones there, but I could have pulled out some truly interesting and horrible comments from the Daily Mail. Thing is, as much as we hate the Daily Mail, you can guarantee when you get on there, it's going to get some links without you doing anything else as well. You know, you end up on nice places like the Cosmo. We've found when you've, pressed it twice there. We often see our stuff go really well in places like Russia and Poland and Czech without us doing any extra work. And the thing is, what you've got to think about at the end as well is, was it a success? So what we do is we come back to our spreadsheet at that point, and we track every single minute that we work on a particular piece of content. So we track every single minute. and that feeds into the spreadsheet, and I'll show you a slide in a minute, shows you the return that we get on some of these pieces. So we're constantly keeping track of absolutely everything, and just because it's finished doesn't mean it's over. So this is a piece of content that we did maybe a couple of years ago, year and a half ago, which was when Pete accidentally found out that The Simpsons had successfully predicted via their color palette every single Pantone color of the year since for the last 10 years or so. And we were waiting around for the Pantone announcement at the tail end of last year, start this year, and they just happened to pick Marge's hair color as the Pantone color of the year. So we just updated the piece of content and went around promoting it again. We have seasonal stuff. We don't always do loads of seasonal stuff, but it just gives you a way to re-promote every year without doing any extra work. And this is the kind of return that we see. So this comes directly from the spreadsheet that we have that tracks everything, and those numbers there attached to anyone who's been doing content for any amount of time will remember that sunshine and the infographic it was attached to many years ago that looked rather rude, but they're the sort of numbers that we can see on return for our clients when we're working on tight and smaller budgets, and we're tracking all of our time, and we're tracking every single link we get, and we're pricing those links up. We can go back to a client and we can show them an actual return. And this comes back to what Corman was saying about art and business having to go hand in hand. And he said, in order to create art today, you have to compromise your art somewhat and be a businessman. And this is something not to make Pete embarrassed, but something that he's been able to bring to our content team incredibly successfully. And, you know, we see decent successes, you know, 75 links plus, even traditional sort of infographics, we still see good stuff on. This was the spreadsheet that you saw earlier about the air in bags of crisps, which was in, you know, even featured on The Independent, where they called us scientists, and I think they also called us boffins. Actually, what happened was in the office, we were chucking bags of crisps into bowls of water, and also then throwing the bags of crisps out of the window to see how many would smash on the way down. So sort of coming back to the B-movie theme, the film industry started to change around 1975 with a film that you will be familiar with called Jaws, and it became the era of the blockbuster. So the B-movie was kind of starting to die off at that point, and the film industry got a, you know, sort of new set of ideals where it was go big or go home, which, you know, has been touted around for years on the content sort of marketing in the industry. And you know, it can work, but you got to be careful. Sometimes it's a bad idea. So, you know, you only have to go over to Wikipedia and find and have a look at some of the biggest flops and how much money they cost the particular studios. I don't know if anyone's seen The Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle, but I can confirm that it was an absolute bag of shit. And there's bunches of these. And one of the things that I noticed when I was looking into this is some of the guys that Roger Corman trained, James Cameron, Ron Howard, these guys have managed to move towards big budget things, but retain Roger Corman's sort of ideals on how to make a movie that's, you know, gives the studio a return. Not everyone's done it. Francis Ford Coppola was one of Corman's proteges, and he failed miserably in the last 20 years and has lost studios a lot of money. And another protege was Dennis Hopper, who made Easy Rider with Peter Honda, which was made for about 360 grand and took 41 million. So the studio went, you know what, Dennis Hopper, you can have all the money you want. We'll give you 100 million for your next film, and you've got full artistic control. And Dennis Hopper went on to make the last movie. That was his second movie. ironically called The Last Movie, and he was exiled from Hollywood for ages. It went wildly over budget, fueled by drugs, ego, and he sort of forgot what Corman had taught him. He put art over art and business. So you've got to be careful to not have the sort of conversation that Hopper had to have with his stakeholders, I guess. You don't want those conversations with your stakeholders. You don't want to be explaining why you've blown a load of budget on a piece of content that got shithole links and got no coverage whatsoever. So something we do at Boom is we make clients very aware at the start, and we use a baseball analogy. It's pretty simple. In baseball, you never hit 3 home runs. So when we start working with a client on content marketing, we let them know that one of them is going to do better than expected, one of them is going to do as expected, and one of them is going to fall flat on its fucking face and get nothing. And when you set that out at the start, it makes that sort of relationship a lot easier. So I guess what I want to say as we finish is be less Dennis Hopper and be more Roger Corman. That's it from me. I've finished waffling and only gone on 5 minutes over how long I promised.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Wayne. Not often you get a history of cinema in with your content marketing, is it? There you go. So I've got a couple of questions coming through. If you have any more that have sprung to mind now that you've heard Wayne's presentation, please do pop those into the Q&A box. But before we get to actually asking the questions, I need to hand over to our second speaker, Hannah. So here we go, getting well onto it, into the screen sharing. Oh, and you've done it in Google Docs as well. Fantastic. Okay. Right, I'm going to shut my mouth and I'm going to let you speak, Hannah. Over to you.
You've a lifetime to make your first album, but only a year or two to make your second, so the saying goes. This is often touted as the excuse for that difficult second album, and it's a topic we explored in 2015 for Concert Hotels. Here's what it looked like. Now, some of you are probably thinking cute, but so what? Well, difficult second album syndrome isn't unique to music artists. Time, I think, is part of the reason that this stuff is hard. Although when it comes to commercial creative work, our timelines are often even tighter than that. We're probably looking at something more like this. So you've a handful of chances to make your first successful thinger and only a year or two to make your second. Sure, please work. But it's not just time that we're working against. Artist Christoph Niemann has suggested that success might actually make things more difficult. He says this: actually, I think success is a burden because I feel like, well, now I have to repeat this. If you've ever created a successful piece, you're likely to be able to relate to that feeling. But even if you haven't made a piece that was successful yet, you'll probably still have experienced something like this. See this thinger that someone else made? It's got loads of coverage. Why aren't we seeing success like that? As a result, I think that difficult second album syndrome has the potential to affect everyone, even if you've not yet had your first big hit. Because on some level, we're all under the same pressure. We're often either trying to replicate our own successes or we're trying to replicate the success of others. But we often fail, and we don't always know why. And perhaps as a result, self-doubt can start creeping in. Now, whenever I begin to doubt myself, a little voice in my head pops up. And this is typically what it says: you're not good enough, and those past successes were just a fluke. Maybe your little voice tells you something different. Maybe you don't have a little voice like that in your head at all, but a lot of us do. And over the years, I've tried a bunch of things to quiet that little voice. I've tried to ignore it. That didn't work. I've attempted to argue with it by seeking out hard evidence to the contrary. That didn't work either. I've even got angry at myself for listening to that little voice, and that definitely didn't work. Actually, it made me feel much worse. This is not a recipe for a happy life, and it makes it much harder to do good work. This year, I've been doing a course with Kirsty Hulse, and Kirsty suggested doing something a little different. She said, listen to that little voice and have a think about what it's trying to tell you. Here's what it says. You keep on trying to make these things and they don't always work, and then you feel bad about yourself. Don't you think you'd feel better about yourself if you just stopped doing these things? And when things aren't going well, I do sometimes think, would I be happier if I didn't do this job? But deep down, I know that doing something other than what I'm doing right now would actually make me less happy. And I have a better relationship with the voice in my head now. Still not quiet, and I don't think it ever will be. But now I understand what it's trying to tell me, I don't feel the need to try and argue with it or get angry with myself about it. And being less preoccupied with that little voice has made it easier for me to do my work. So if you have a similar little voice, maybe trying that exercise will help you too. Okay, it's probably enough about the little voice in my head. We're all under much the same pressure. We're often either trying to replicate our own successes or we're trying to replicate the success of others. We often fail, but we don't always know why. Today, I'm going to explore why we fail, or more accurately, why I think we fail. So let's do this. If we're seeking to recreate the success of another piece, first we need to understand why the original piece was successful. And we think we ought to be pretty good at this because we're programmed to spot patterns. The trouble is, our ability to spot patterns doesn't necessarily serve us well. I think Crime Scene, The Vanishing at the Cecil Hotel is a great example of this. In 2013, Elisa Lam, a young Canadian traveller, goes missing and is eventually found dead at the hotel. But what happened to her? Well, internet sleuths came up with a range of theories. She was killed by a Mexican death metal singer. She was the victim of a copycat killing. She was involved in an international conspiracy to spread a new strain of tuberculosis. All those theories were based on patterns that were spotted. The trouble is, those patterns were just coincidences. We're great at spotting patterns, but we find it much harder to distinguish whether or not those patterns are meaningful. Perhaps you think that you're immune. You know Nicolas Cage films do not cause people to drown in swimming pools. That still might not protect you though. This is Will Critchler, and he's pretty smart, right? He talks a lot about causation and correlation not being the same thing. Back in 2015, a bunch of us at Distilled were fascinated by the success of this beer map. And we were talking a lot about why it was so successful. And this is what Will said. I saw this piece in a few places and was also puzzled by how it was so popular. Didn't really get what all the fuss was about, except, you know, beer. Now, I don't think that beer was the reason this piece was successful. If beer was the reason, then every piece about beer would be successful, and that's definitely not the case. The trouble is we often absorb thinking like this. I want to talk briefly about something called sense making. Sense making is not just about how individuals make sense of things. It's about how organizations or groups of people make sense of things. When thinking about why a piece was successful, we're often guilty of jumping quickly to a plausible explanation, then moving on. But one person getting one thing a little bit wrong shouldn't be a problem, right? Sense making is a social activity. Plausible stories are preserved, retained, and shared. We absorb these plausible stories and they affect the way we interpret future events. If we accept that beer is the reason that this piece is successful, what happens when we see another successful piece about beer? We identify a pattern and we lock onto it. And then all future successful pieces we encounter about beer add evidence to support this explanation. In effect, this explanation over time gets more and more true. We believe it more and more. And I see this happening in a lot of directions at once. What else do these two pieces have in common? They're both maps. Again, there's a pattern. All future successful pieces we encounter, which are maps, add evidence to support this explanation. But if that were actually true, every map-based piece would be successful, and it's definitely not the case. These explanations are both really easy to debunk. And I'm sure that most of you don't think that like beer or map is the only reason those pieces were successful. Perhaps you'd also tell me it's because they offer journalists something that they don't have the time or resource to create themselves. And I'd acknowledge, yes, that's true. The trouble is, I've made several pieces about resonant topics like beer, which offer journalists something that they don't have the time or resource to create themselves. And nevertheless, they weren't all successful. And I think that pretty much any reason you give me, I could debunk in much the same way. And yet, at various times, I've said things like this: study what works and try to deconstruct why. I said that in 2013. I said something very similar in 2014, and again in 2016. In fact, in almost every presentation or talk I've ever given, I think I've mentioned something like this. But despite saying this a bunch of times, I wasn't always that great at actually figuring out why a piece was successful. I spent a lot of time looking at successful pieces, but probably not nearly enough time looking at the coverage they generated. Often, I'd actually be looking at a successful piece and trying to slot it neatly into one of my ready prepared explanations. And those explanations aren't entirely wrong, but they aren't actually that helpful. Now, I still think there's merit in this advice. Study the piece and try and just deconstruct why it worked. But we need to somehow make sure we're arriving at a better answer than beer or map. We need to ask better questions. So rather than asking myself, why was this piece successful, I try to answer these questions instead. What stories did journalists write when they covered this piece? Now, you can still answer this in a pretty shallow way, right? If you were doing it for this beer piece, you could write something like, when journalists covered this piece, they wrote stories about beer. Don't do that. Look at the stories journalists actually wrote. If you look back at that old coverage, you'll see that there were a bunch of different story types that were written. There was a lot of outrage at how insipid the winning beers were in various locations. Some journalists did analysis on the two major brewers, InBev and SAB Miller, who own most of these beers, and their pieces were more like globalization pieces. But also travel journalists wrote nostalgic travel stories about all the places they'd been and their memories of drinking these beers. Lots and lots of different stories were going on. Something else you could look at: did the coverage of this piece feed into something else that was going on in the news cycle? It's like another news story or a trend. Could also look at whether or not there were waves of coverage that led to the ultimate success of the piece. Ask yourself, if one of those things hadn't happened, would it still have been a success? Look at what emotions the coverage provoked, as in like in you, and also within readers by reading the comments, even on the Daily Mail. Also look at verticals or types of publication, and whether or not the piece got coverage in multiple countries. This is obviously way more work. Do we really need to do all that? Well, I think we do, and here's why. Typically, we replicate success in one of two ways. We have a remake and a remix. I'm going to explain the two. So this is a remake. It's called Highways to Hell, and it's a mashup of publicly available data sources on the most congested roads. And this is what we were remaking. It was created by a vehicle tracking company. So we've used a different data set, but we're still answering the same question the previous piece did. So same topic, same idea, I'm calling this a remake. Unicorn League is a remix. In this piece, we explored what these $1 billion companies and their founders have in common. And this is the piece we were remixing, an old piece of ours at the time. This is when I was at Verve. It's called Billionaires League, and it explores what the world's billionaires have in common. Both pieces explore the same thing. What traits do this cohort share? But one looks at billionaires and the other looks at unicorn companies and their founders. Same idea, different topic, remix. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with doing either of these things. I've done both many times. But both remakes and remixes are prone to failure. Remakes often feel like a safe bet, but that's not always the case. This is best explained with examples, so I'm going to take 2 remakes and try to determine if they'd still be successful if we remade them again today. So, should we remake this remake? This is Highways to Hell. The conditions that led to the success of this piece are actually alive and well today. Journalists continue to write stories about these types of studies, and they don't seem to mind that the winners, i.e. the worst roads, don't change much. If you remade this piece with a new data set, you could reasonably expect to get the similar levels of success, even if the winners don't change. Now, obviously, there is a slight problem here in that someone else could beat you to it, but let's just assume you got there first. In essence, I think remaking this remake is a reasonably safe bet, but it's not always the case. This is another remake that we did at Verve. It's called Director's Cut. And here we were looking at the movies with the highest on-screen death counts. So should we remake this remake? Well, just so you know, this is what the original piece, this is the piece we were remaking. So for our remake, we gathered new data and we found a new winner. So in the previous version, Lord of the Rings won, and for us, Guardians of the Galaxy won. Studies about on-screen death counts are not something entertainment journalists perpetually cover. They don't behave in the same way as motoring journalists. And early coverage came about because the new winner was surprising and controversial. You can see the subhead here, apparently Star Wars doesn't count. No, babe, doesn't count. Shortly after the piece launched, director James Gunn shared a piece of early coverage and then spent 2 hours arguing with people about it on Twitter. A huge chunk of the coverage the piece subsequently received was just journalists reporting on James Gunn's tweets. What are the chances of you replicating that? If you fail to find a new winner, you'll almost certainly struggle to gain coverage because I don't think Gunn's going to spend another 2 hours on Twitter. But even with a new winner, you still might struggle. On balance, I think remaking this piece is not quite such a safe bet. But what about remixes? Well, with remixes, I think the reasons for failure are slightly different. Let's look at a couple. So this is a piece that I did when I was at Distilled about Candy Crush, and it's a remix of this piece, which we did about Instagram. As with most remixes, my justification for making the Candy Crush piece was largely based on the success of the Instagram piece. I think I went something like this. This piece helps people contextualize and understand just how big Instagram is. And so I asserted this piece will be successful because it will help people contextualize and understand just how big Candy Crush is. I thought that these two topics were broadly comparable, and therefore these pieces would likely share similar levels of success. What I failed to acknowledge was how journalists were writing about Instagram and Candy Crush were not the same. Actually, journalists weren't writing about Candy Crush much at all. I'd love to tell you that I've never made that mistake again, but I have. Buoyed by the success of Unicorn League, we remixed it again for crafts. Again, I failed to acknowledge that the way journalists write about crafts is not the same as the way they write about unicorns and their founders. I've frequently been guilty of believing that the ways journalists write about different topics are the same when often they really aren't. Okay, let's wrap this thing up. Why do we struggle to recreate the success of previous pieces? I think it's because we often fail to understand why they really worked. Trying to answer these sorts of questions might give you a clearer understanding. It's important that we try to do this because these patterns that we're so fond of spotting can leave us exposed. Patterns like beer and map don't allow us to acknowledge this stuff. Remakes often fail when we're not able to recreate the conditions which led to the success of the original piece, and remixes often fail when we don't understand what journalists are actually writing about in the niche we're working in. So, changing our approach, though, could reduce our exposure. The conditions that led to the success of this piece are still in play, so remaking this is a reasonably safe bet. This one, Director's Cut, was a weird outlier. Journalists do not perpetually write stories like this. Remaking this might not be such a safe bet. What about remixes? Again, changing our approach might reduce our exposure here too. When we launched this piece, lots of journalists were writing about just how big Instagram was getting. When we launched this piece, Candy Crush had arguably already peaked. No one was writing much about its growth anymore. I'd like to leave you with a couple of final thoughts. This stuff is really hard. The following stats are from ERA's 2020 State of Link Building report. 28% of us have created a campaign in the last year that secured no links at all. If you've not managed to create a campaign that achieved over 100 links in the past 12 months, then you're not alone. Neither have the vast majority. 79% of the respondents to the ERA survey have not seen this level of success either. The vast majority of campaigns created are not successful. I've launched far more misses than hits, and everyone fails a lot more often than you probably realise. Putting together this talk has been pretty eye-opening for me. I've gone back over a lot of old talks and blog posts. There are a bunch of things that I've said and written in the past which were well meant, but were either horribly incomplete or easy to misinterpret, or both. So I'd encourage you to think critically about what I've shared here. For example, are all campaigns either remixes or remix? Probably not, right? Because it's not the only way we come up with ideas. Are these the only reasons we fail? No. But I'm hoping that I've given you some new things to think about. I'll say it again, I'll encourage you to think critically about what I've shared here. I'd also encourage you to continue to think critically about some of the explanations of successful pieces you might have absorbed. Remember that beer is rarely the answer. Good luck out there, and thank you very much.